In the previous video, we looked at step 5, taking a sample and arriving at a decision. Now, when we go to interpret that result, there's a little bit of nuance that I want to talk about. So in our past examples, we've been working with a couple examples, and namely, here we're looking at this statement that the mean income in a population or in a community here is at least 52,000. We looked at a sample in the orange here where we took a sample size of 49,000, and then the sample standard deviation was 3,000. Again, just to summarize, we're looking at a one-tailed test, sample size of 25, and so we're using the t value. We set our critical value at negative 1.711, and when we took the sample here in orange, we found a t of what did we find? Negative 5. And so that was enough evidence to reject the null. And so in interpreting the cases where we reject the null is pretty straightforward. We are rejecting that null hypothesis. We have found enough evidence to reject it, and we're going to go then with the alternative hypothesis and then assume that is true. We also looked at the case where in the blue here, where we perhaps we imagine we took the sample and the sample standard deviation was 13,000, and I made mention that this, our original 3,000 was probably, I made up that number, and it's probably a little tighter than you'd typically see for a income standard deviation. But so when we crunched the numbers with an x bar of 49,000 and an s of 13,000, we ended up with a t value of negative 1.076. So at that point, it did not reach our critical value. We did not reject the null hypothesis. And so when we interpret that result, we do not have enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis. So here's the nuance. It doesn't mean that we are proving that the null hypothesis is true. Rather that we simply do not have enough evidence to reject it. And in fact, we never technically prove the null hypothesis true. We could always be making an error. Of course, we could always be making an error in the first case too, when we did reject the null. So errors are always possible, and so we do want to bear that in mind. But also when we reject, or when we fail to reject the null, it does not necessarily mean that we are proving the null hypothesis correct. We can look briefly again back at our chopstick example, and here we also looked at two different samples. So the yellow one here, perhaps we took a sample the first day, and it looks, or we do not have evidence. So we found a z-score of negative 1.5. We didn't have enough evidence to reject the null. Again, we have not proved that the mean is 10 centimeters, but we have not shown statistical evidence enough to hit the big red button and shut down production. Whereas the second day, or the next time we took the sample, we found a z of 3. In that case, we did reject the null, and we would then move forward accepting or assuming that the alternative hypothesis is correct. So you'll have some more practice with interpreting these, but we do want to be careful when we interpret them and use the correct kind of mindset and terminology. We'll be back with a video talking about the errors that can arise. So that is also what we want to be bearing in mind as we look at these sample results, is that we need the humility to know that errors are a distinct possibility.